It's really good to be here with you guys. Again, Paul Martini. I'm with iBoss, and I have Jack Ham here, Vice President of Security and Architecture at Albertsons. So we want to cover all these concepts of zero trust and security service edge, but from the perspective of an actual implementation and actual use. I know there's a lot of buzzwords out there and a lot of discussions around these concepts, and we want to just take a step back and see how this is actually used and how it can benefit your organization. So, Jack, if you want to say a few words.
There's a lot of buzzwords about zero trust?
Yeah.
I didn't know this. So thanks for everyone for having us out here. I am actively deploying right now, and so I can tell you that it can be done. And it can be done fast, and I'm going to recommend we don't do that, but I will talk a bit about that. And, I think for me, the big goal that we had in this when I got to Albertsons was that we have, we're a $74 billion company, 325,000 employees, and my mandate was make security modern. And so that's how I started the journey.
Yeah, and so I think that's a lot of people start the journey, right, is how do we modernize the way people work, the way people connect, how we secure data and applications. And I think, as we think about, we see a lot of convergence going on within the space. There's a lot of legacy types of technology that are now evolving and converging into more of the modern SaaS type of approach. And I think understanding where the budget comes from, what is it that's actually being replaced and how this enables the organization to be more efficient is pretty important. So we'll talk a little bit about that. We're going to go into some best practices as well, so you can see how this is actually applied. And then we'll go through some examples in terms of how you can use this for things like continuous adaptive access to protect data and applications and resources. So just to start, just a couple, just set the foundation here is when you look at CISA, they did a study last year which covered all the top 3 initial infection vectors for ransomware. And it turns out that even though there were phishing attacks, stolen credentials, and things like that, the root cause ultimately was unauthorized access to the application to begin with. So you can see that there's so many vulnerabilities coming out on a daily basis for all of these applications. And you have to wonder that in the past, with a lot of perimeters and a lot of data centers, attackers just couldn't get to the front door of the data and the applications in order to perform the attack. But today, with these applications being scattered all over SaaS, cloud infrastructure, and on-prem, the surface area of these applications are pretty exposed. So ultimately, zero trust, according to NIST, which we'll talk about, is really founded in solving this root cause of the issue, which is how do you prevent unauthorized access to resources. So as far as Albertsons, how did you guys think about, when you were approaching this? I know you guys are going through a cloud transformation as well, data center migrations and things like that.
Yeah, we were, when I joined about 15 months ago, we were broadly down a cloud migration journey. For those of you who have done it, yes, it looked a lot like the data center had been moved to Azure. But we have started to move through that next set of maturity. And so one of the things that looking at the practical question of how are we going to manage this, like you start ending up in the situation where some groups are starting to do the cloud better, other groups are sort of lagging, but this gap gets larger, and we end up having to protect the entire life cycle of this. And so when we started to look at questions like, well, what tech stays, what tech goes, we had legacy VPNs, we had your standard sort of fare of things, and the question became, what can we collapse, and then what can we do to get the best visibility and the broadest coverage? So we've got, if you think about it, we have, 4 or 5 corporate offices, 2,200 stores, 100 supply chain facilities, manufacturing, distribution, and we need something that is going to cover all of that. So when I look at this, the initial goal of it really was like, what gets us broad coverage? So it doesn't matter where people are coming from, we're at least going to see them cross over. So everyone's heard SASE, so the more acronyms, but to me this is the question of where do I get my visibility choke point in this? And then second to that is how are we going to then move forward to actually apply controls in a consistent fashion? So that was the driving point from the business side. It made a very compelling argument because we were able to demonstrate that we were going to collapse, in our case, 5 different technologies down into one. And so from budget acquisition, from negotiating with the rest of the tech leaders, that certainly ended up being a much easier play. So, yeah.
Yeah, as you think about legacy technology and modernizing, it's not that you're necessarily creating budget from nowhere. The way we think about this is you're looking at legacy budgets that you're spending in other places. For example, proxies that might be protecting on-prem data centers, VPNs, which users are using in an inefficient way to connect to applications that happen to live in the cloud while they work remote, and also things like VDI, where you want to get a guest or a contractor, you want to give them access to an application, but you don't want the data to touch their laptop. So this technology already existed. These types of things are really what consolidate into Zero Trust or Security Service Edge. They just become the SaaS equivalent. I like to think of it as like the Netflix equivalent of that type of technology, where it's the same type of technology, it just applies everywhere, right? Data centers.
I would also note, though, that the other thing is even now in the post-COVID world, like a company like Albertsons being a supermarket chain, we're sort of used to remote, but the other challenge that we were still struggling with was the question of how do we handle this hybrid remote workforce. So that was another big driving one on this.
Yeah, because you have, I think there, especially as the new space evolves, there's going to be a lot of consolidation and I think merging of concepts. For us, as we think about Zero Trust access according to NIST, and then we look at Security Service Edge or SASE, one side is really talking about the security aspects like Security Service Edge, and then NIST talks a lot about the security as well as the connectivity. But really, this is really about both access, connectivity, as well as security. And so as you think about having a concept or an approach, it really becomes quite simple. Your surface area is your applications and your data. And your goal is really to put a checkpoint in front of those applications. Actually, NIST uses this example as well, so that the only way you can get to these applications is if that request is allowed or authorized by a service, which means you also get logging and visibility. So if you're in a security operations center, you want to see every single access, you probably want to apply conditional access. So if a device gets infected, typically what happens is it goes and infects every other server and every other system on that network. You want to cut access automatically. So the goal is ultimately to make things accessible. And NIST, with their framework, which is part of the risk management framework, they call it the 800-207. They really break this down into resource access and all of the pieces of the puzzle to make that possible. So as you think about NIST, Jack, like how does Albertsons think about that in this idea of having like a service edge or a single service edge that can be the gatekeeper to applications and data?
Yeah, so I think when we sort of look across, so I own architecture and engineering, and to me, using something like 207 in this case, it makes it a lot easier to talk with the GRC folks, with other people in InfoSec to sort of align on some goals around it. I, like anyone else in engineering, I spend a lot of time being like, don't tell me about tools, tell me about what we're doing. So this is a good way for us to pull this thread together. Realistically, I don't know how much of 207 for us ends up being adopted. I think it's a good framework to start with, but one of the things that I sort of see when especially in the vendor side of the space is that you're going to someday be fully compliant, and I don't think that's going to be a realistic end state, and I don't think it should be a realistic end state for a lot of people. The joke internally is we've got to keep the tomatoes safe, and now the reality though is that we obviously have some places where we're very concerned. Sensitive data, HIPAA, we have pharmacies, we have PCI, but the idea that we would go down the path for full alignment, I don't think that jives. It's the same question of like, are you trying to say you're going to get to a CMMI level 5? Like most people don't need that, but from a discussion standpoint, from a starting point to get you moving, this is a good document to use. One of the things that I think for me is the most central portion of it, though, is really the part around the single decision point. So when I looked at the tool rail coming in, there's 5, 10, 15, 20 different places people are going in to apply controls. And the thing is that if you've got enough traffic flowing, you're never going to get all the coverage you need there. So this gives you a way to start to ask the question of like, what does a central control point look like? In our case, it became very clear that this was a network access control point. The other thing, of course, is that we have some unique challenges in that we have a lot of shared systems. So in retail, not everyone has a named account. And so now you have the question of how are you going to control and broker access in a situation where 10, 15, 20 people are using a machine. And that one ends up really benefiting from the notion of all the centralized traffic flow, because even questions like behavior analytics, what does your behavioral analytics look like if one person uses a machine and then someone different uses it immediately after? And unless you've got all this broad traffic flow going into one place, you're not going to be able to start to put that story together over time. The other thing for us too is just we're so distributed in general. So we multiple corporate offices, people remote. Like I don't go to a corporate office. I live outside of Vegas. So I go to Black Hat and have fun there. But you do end up in this scenario of with all this distribution, if you just were to go the normal approach of like, gee, it's going to be endpoint, optional VPN, things like that, there's going to be these glaring gaps in time where you just don't see everything. In many ways, we are well along our usage and deployment now, and in some ways it's almost too much. And so, I think we're going to talk a little bit later about some recommendations, but be careful what you wish for, I guess, is going to be part of my recommendation. So,
yeah, it's a journey, right? I think that's some of the misconceptions, at least that we see, is things like ZTNA or Zero Trust Access is about replacing your VPN, accessing on-prem applications, or it's just about connectivity, right? It's a journey. You're basically trying to create a foundational platform or framework which forms a central decision point that has the ability to grant or deny access to any application, whether it's SaaS, on-prem, or cloud infrastructure, as well as generate log events at all times. So the idea is that the user, for example, may be on an airplane, they might be at this conference, their laptop is the office. All of the data is encrypted. They don't really care what they're connected to. They just need transportation. That encrypted data goes to a service edge. That service edge connects them to what they need, whether it's in the enterprise or on the public internet, and ensures that the data ends up where it should end up. It doesn't leak to the wrong places. They're not picking up malware, and their connections aren't being hijacked as well. And so as you look at this diagram here, you really want to take this in a phased approach. There isn't, I think some people think they're going to flip a switch and they're zero trust or they have SASE or SSE. You basically want to do this in phases where you may decommission things like your VPN, because the VPN connects people to the office, but what about things in SaaS and other places, as well as the continuous adaptive access that you need to apply to those connections. But as a foundation, you see that you have users and assets at the bottom that need access to a resource. And one of the core concepts in NIST 800-207 is they don't really say on-prem resource or cloud resource or SaaS. They just say an enterprise resource, something you're trying to protect, an application or data. And this central, what Jack just described as the central decision point, they call it a PEP, a policy enforcement point. And the goal of the PEP is no different than that of an airport, security checkpoint. I actually like the analogy that they use, which is you walk up to the checkpoint, the resource is the airplane, and the goal of the checkpoint is to determine whether they allow that passenger to cross or deny access. If you don't have a ticket, you don't have your ID, you're just denied by default, but we still need to check the bags. We want to make sure there's no weapons or anything that might damage the plane. If you use that analogy, but instead replace the airplane with your applications and your data, not the public internet, but actually the applications and the data that you own as an enterprise, the checkpoint becomes this policy enforcement point. And then its job is to really make the same decision, but it's going to make this decision not by opening luggage, but by using signals. Is this user, tell me more about the device, tell me more about the user. Do they use multi-factor? If this device is infected and they should have access, let's cut access immediately, because we don't want that infection to spread. Because there's no way to get to that airplane or to your data without being granted access or authorized through this policy enforcement point. So this concept, what is this concept? You mentioned a single service edge, as you think about SaaS, on-prem and cloud, why is that important to Albertsons to have a single, this idea of a single edge? Because I know we see a lot of times where, you have some edges that are for on-prem access, some edges are for SaaS-based applications, but this unification of an edge.
I'm sure everyone knows exactly where all their bits are moving, right? So look, if you think like an end game of what we can do with security. It's not just that we can block. Like at some point in time, we want to be able to take other signals. We want to be able to automate things back. I think SOAR was really going to be a great thing a few years ago, but the materialization of it didn't come along, and part of it was because of the fact that we were still too fractured, I think, in the way we handled systems. So getting everything funneled through here is, like, for me, one of the foundational parts of that, because now I've got this data stream. I can put it into data lake or maybe a data swamp, like, depending on how good we do with curation. But it gives us a foundation to eventually go back and ask a question about how do we now use this. So the story I always try to sell, and it's what I'm working towards now. Whether or not we ever get there, I don't know. But Friday, you haven't changed your password because we haven't adopted the new NIST guidance on password expiration. You come in Monday, you forget the password, and you try to log in and you're locked, it doesn't let you in. You try to log in again, it doesn't let you in. But then on the third time, you type your password wrong and it lets you in. Why? Because we have all the data. We know you're sitting in an office. We can see the signal of Bluetooth LE. We know your typing cadence. And so we unlock you. Somebody from the SOC calls up and says, hey, it seems like you're locked out. Can I help reset your password? Now you've got human validation, and you just continue, and we just remove all the friction. We're a ways off from that right now, but that's the goal, like, I'm swimming towards, right? And so, but none of that happens if we don't have everything passing one control plane. And the other thing too is just, this also lets us, if you think about this being a subject accessing a resource, this lets us control then the resource side. So we now have to trust a much smaller on the back end. I sort of don't like the zero trust nomenclature. Like, I get why it's used, but this is not that. This is, I don't want to say it's explicit trust. It's like refined trust. And because you do trust things, right? Like, we trust the providers that we have to use, and we have to be able to ask questions about, like, what's their ability to deliver. So the end of the day, though, is why is that important? Because it gives us, we're taking all the threads of things we have to trust, both from our users and then from our vendors, and we're squeezing them all down into one point. Now, like, we don't use choke point analogies because that slows things down, but it's very different. It's not a choke point, it's an observation point. And so that's what I think we get out of having this.
Yeah, definitely. As a central foundation, you're going to have tools. You're going to have endpoint vendors. You have SIEMs, that store your log events and things like that. The logs need to come from somewhere. And so this idea that you have a service edge, SASE or security service edge, is this idea of a service that runs in the cloud, but can also extend into a data center. These policy enforcement points can be wherever the resource is close. I like this concept of close to the user security, but I also think close to the resource is just as important, because you want the shortest path between that user and that application, so that they're not hopping around to get to the things they need. But ultimately, it generates the log events that feed the SOC, the security operation, that feed the SIEM, but also extend these concept of adaptive access. I think I like the idea here that it's not about no trust, it's adaptive trust. The more signals we have, the more confidence we have in your request, the more likely we're going to let you through. If you're traveling domestically, you could do that with your state ID. If you go international, you're going to need your passport. Yep. It's really confidence in identity levels, and this is really what the service edge is really providing. Is again, as you replace the VPN, it's not really about replacing a VPN to get a different VPN. It's the fact that the user no longer needs to turn a VPN on to access the things they need in an office or in the cloud or anywhere else, because the service connects them to that.
That's actually a funny one too. When we first started announcing the rollout, someone was like, do you mean I don't have to think about turning the VPN on to go to certain sites? And I was like, no, you won't have to do that in the future. And that alone was enough to get a lot of people on board with the idea, is just not having to remember when you have to turn it on. And that is the other side of it too, is that if you don't have this in a centralized traffic pattern going all through one place, you can't offer that, because you would still then have to have a decision point about the need to log into the VPN. So from a user friction standpoint, this starts to allow you to get back down. I think generally speaking, probably long-term goal for most, no one should know their security tools are doing things, right? Because when they do something to intervene, it's either automatic and they don't need to know about it, or if it is actually related to the user, be it insider threat, data loss or something, that that is very clear to them that when it interacts with them, it's interacting with them for a reason. And you're not ending up in this fuzzy space in the middle where where your employees are looking at this and they're not quite sure why the tool's doing what it's doing. So that's the other thing, that like you just won't get that if you don't have the same way, a way to be consistent across user groups, different types of users. Admins you might want to treat differently, obviously, like execs you're going to treat differently. So.
Yeah, and I think that's what, as you extend that concept and, you talk about this concept of VPN, a lot of misconceptions is replace a VPN with a private access type of technology to connect them to an office, when in reality, it's sort of like an enterprise-wide private network where the laptop itself can be anywhere, but it's always part of the network because there isn't a physical network. And what it means for IT and decommissioning data centers is the fact that if you move these applications around, let's say you're moving applications and you're going to shut down a data center, you can move them to SaaS or to AWS or Azure. The user never needs to know about it because they never had to turn on a VPN to access it anyways. The service connects them to wherever they need. So the flexibility of even doing these transitions are a lot easier and basically allow the users to just do their job in an efficient way. So one of the things, when we look at these, we think of these in these 5 buckets or 5 pillars. And in the previous diagram you saw there was users at the bottom with their laptops, and they needed access to resources. The resources being enterprise applications and data. And then you have the checkpoint, which is the service that's running, and it's doing continuous evaluation of whether the access should occur. When you look at these 5 pillars, it really starts with, first understanding the health of the devices. Like if a device is infected or unhealthy, you definitely don't want it touching your enterprise resources. It's just going to spread ransomware everywhere. Understanding who the user is, being the second pillar. How confident are we that the person is who they say they are? Jack, you use that example, like, it's not just your username and password. Someone can steal a session. You get a cookie session stolen by China. Should that be used from China to access an application where the user should never be accessing from that? It's not where they logged in from. So the confidence in the user identity, knowing exactly what the data and the applications are. They typically call this CASB, but I think CASB and these other terms are just the technology used to actually meet the business goal, and the business objective is, if I don't understand what the applications and the data are that I'm trying to protect, then how do I even set up controls to know? So this discovery piece, because the users are going through a service edge, it's automatically discovering what it is that exists inside the organization, so it organizes them by on-prem, cloud, SaaS, and you'll find things that you may not even know exists, SSH, RDP, shadow IT, those types of things. Then finally, in the last 2 is, and I think the 4th is one of the most important, it's actually one of the core, is authorization and access control, which is giving someone the privilege to interact with the resource. Not at the point, many misinterpret that they look at this from the perspective at the time of login. So when they go to punch in their credentials into Azure AD or into Okta, because it does authorize you to access the resource, but 99.999% of your interactions happen after login. So when your device gets infected and starts to spread infections, that's not at the point of login, it's after you've logged in. If your session gets stolen by someone in Russia and they start using that session to get into your applications, that's after login, the login already occurred. But having a continuous, what I consider continuous adaptive access, means that for every single request, a decision is made, not just at the point of login, beyond login. And then lastly, if something bad happens, let me know about it and make sure it makes it to my SIM. Yeah. So how do you think about these, and how does that fit into what you guys are doing there at Albertsons?
Yeah, I think the continuous authorization is one of the most compelling points, because this is something that user starts behaving weirdly and they're an IT admin. That is what's going to allow you to revoke their administrator privileges, like in real time, not the next time they need to MFA, not because it's an impossible travel schedule, but the actual ability to go in and live stop something. And for very large orgs with lots of users, like there's a lot of signals in there. The compliance side, I'm an engineer by trade, so I sort of, I'm sorry about it, it was a gloss over compliance, but I know it's helpful for the compliance team. The incident response side, however, I have done that before, and so the ability to go in again in this notion of a single platform and be able to look at things, make decisions, like the augment from the ops side of the house is enormous, because not only do we have, EDR and they can go look at that, but they can actually then go in and they don't have to wonder, like, is this going to be coming from the IDS? Is it going to be coming from the firewall logs? They know where it's coming from. And so they'll have one place to go and make this work decision. So from that point of view, it's just going to speed all of that up. The other side, which it is compliance related, but the discovery of applications and data movement, I think, is one of the other ones for us at least that's really big. A lot of data in retail for anybody else in there, a lot of data in every company. And the question of what's it doing, where's it going, what's data in motion look like, especially when it comes to the question of how are users interacting with it and how are people downstream using it. Like, if you don't have like single platform, you're now wondering, like, is someone downloading something to a laptop? And now you're suddenly trying to reconcile your data provider side, so your Office 365, your Google Drive, whatever, with client signals coming from agents. And so if you think about it, like, you would say, well, no, I have end-to-end visibility, but you don't. You have 2 points of visibility and a big gap in the middle. And so, again, I like viewing this as grabbing a bunch of strings and pulling them all together and then seeing what they're doing, because now I have end-to-end, and you can tie it into that. We were just talking backstage about the ability to leverage labeling inside of your cloud provider, inside of your drive services, to then also enforce labeling for moving data, which, I hadn't even thought of that use case up to this point, and that's a big one, because we're always interested in how data classification moves, how data flows. So I think across the whole thing, really the driver on this is, it goes back to the central point. It's also nice for the engineering teams in general, because we're now in a place where we can go one place and do all the controls, and the engineering teams aren't having to ask the question of, like, where does this apply in the network? Where do we go? So even from just the level of overhead to run it is much lower for us.
Yeah, and to your point, Jack, when you think about the old, I like to think old way, new way. Old way is, let's look at the, IPS in the data center, or let's grab, whether there are logs there or setting up roles and proxies that might be residing in different offices. The new way is you set a role, and a service, a cloud service, applies that role equally and consistently across everything, whether it's a remote user that's working at home, someone that's in an office, because location becomes irrelevant. So you have consistent logs and consistent access decisions. And as you think about, like, conditional access, we talked a bit just briefly about logging in, doing conditional access to the point of login. Realistically, if you look at a situation where someone logs into an application, but yet that session gets stolen, and now it's being used 1,000, 2,000 miles away, if you're doing per request continuous adaptive access, things signals like, why is the location of where that's being used so much different from where they logged in? And you can see that in real time and cut that access, so that you're not in a situation where, we just saw a recent breach, just a large organization just recently, where tons and tons of data was hijacked from the data center because someone stole the VPN, got in through the VPN credentials and things like that. But having the central point makes all of these things possible. The data labeling as well is also a great point. If you look at a diagram like this, what we like about this idea of a single unified service edge is, if you look at the center here, that's the service that's performing authorization. Basically, think of that as the airport security checkpoint, but it actually extends across a cloud service, in this case iBoss, and then also within the data center. So you see these cubes kind of sitting in the data center. That becomes really important, because as a user goes back on-prem, they're going to have resources on-prem as well. You don't want to send the data out to some cloud service and bounce back. You can create paths that are directly from that user on-prem to a resource on-prem and still isolate the application completely. But most importantly, from a budget perspective, it allows you to grab legacy proxies, on-prem proxies and things that they're really like islands only protected the data center, and use these policy enforcement points as drop-in replacements. They're on-site policy enforcement points, but they're linked to a global service. So now you've just got budget from an existing on-prem only type of scenario and extended it the other way around, where now you inherit all of the security for the remote users, which are going to go through a cloud security edge, which is all consistent policies for authorization, logging, and visibility. I know you have data centers and things like that as well.
Yep. I think though we're going to run up on time here, and I promise some recommendations. Yeah. So one, there's going to be suddenly a lot of features available. You're going to have to keep the engineering teams from turning everything on. So the way we approached this with our deployment was we said, look, we've got all these capabilities we're replacing. Day one question is get a platform out that replicates everything we have, down to whatever the allow lists were. Because you suddenly have a situation where you now have a tool that potentially offers you a lot more features to get in people's way, and avoiding a PR nightmare is always good. So one is don't go that route. Two is don't try to do everything at once. We are going through sort of looking at the broadest flows, looking at the broadest data movement, and asking, okay, where do we get the best bang for the buck? The diagrams you see all around this from all the vendors, like, they show a very future state that you're going to have to evolve to. So you might have VPNs still. It doesn't mean you're not on the journey. Like, you may very well live in a hybrid situation like that for a while, and it's okay. It's obviously it's back to how you view risk, you view the threat model. But the idea that you would go from zero to zero trust, oh God, no, I didn't make that joke. But the idea that you would do that in one movement is just not realistic. It's going to take time. You're talking about agents, you're talking about changing identity workflows, SAML workflows, even asking questions like, what groups do you apply? You brought up the writing rules for the IDS or the IPS, but those rules aren't based on identities. They're based on network traffic flow. So stop and think now, what is it going to mean when you ask the question, not what does an intrusion prevention rule look like for the PCI network, but what does it look like for people who access the PCI network? You're going to have a very different problem set to think about. So it's also going to require a lot of mind shift thinking in terms of how the teams work. And then, I think the other thing is, like, figure out where you get the best benefit in terms of your own risk, because if you think about it in terms of everything you could possibly do around this, this is a multi-year roadmap. Right now we're exiting platform deployment, and we got a bunch of things we're going to do next, and we're going to be tuning for probably another 2-3 years until we're in a state that we think we're going to go forward in. And then the last one is that this gives enough refinement, because again, in this model you're looking at the people, that from the executive level, go out to the business and explain what you can do, because there's suddenly things you can do for the business that can build huge alliances. Because think of like browser sandboxing. Some components of your business might be very worried about people being able to download data. And so you now have the ability to go out and actually leverage security tools to really solve the business problem, but that's only because it's tied to identity.
Yeah, so thanks for joining us. And I think that's probably one of the best advices you can get, is that it's a journey. This is not a light switch. So having a nice, solid foundation enables you to do all of these things as you move forward. But it really, really is transformative. So yeah, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having us.